evening to all, and those of you that are still joining us and that have just joined us, and welcome to another edition of Unpacking Hate as we talk about extremism, brought to you by SDSU Cares. Now, this is all made possible by a partnership that we have with the McCain Institute's Peer-to-Peer Protective Project. So what are we here to do? Well, we're here to have some meaningful dialogue centered around a lot of the challenges that we have with and through violent extremism as it affects us in our SDSU community, but also around the country. So what we have in store for you this evening is two wonderful speakers to help us unpack some of these things. And we're going to have some meaningful dialogue to hopefully bring through some good talks. We should have two presenters that will speak for approximately 20 minutes each, followed by an opportunity for all of you to ask questions. So please direct all of those to the chat block of the host, and we'll try and get those fielded at the end. Lastly, this live event will be recorded for your information. So please be courteous and mute your microphones so not as to disrupt our presenters. All right. So without further ado, I want to first introduce one of my teammates, Caitlin Morris, and she's going to talk to you a bit about SDSU Cares and our partnership with the McCain Institute's Peer-to-Peer Protective Project before we begin. So without further ado, Caitlin, all yours.
Thank you, Jamar. Hello, everyone. My name is Caitlin Morris, and I am a member of the SDSU Cares Initiative, along with Jamar Miles, Becky Carbett, Gage Smith, Sal Pimentel, Karina Venegas, Seth Hildebrand, and Shiloh Shart. On behalf of SDSU Cares, I want to thank Jamar for moderating the final webinar in our series, and the speakers for taking the time to discuss and educate on this important issue. Here at SDSU Cares, we know that the key to stopping hate and targeted violence in our campus community is to educate all community members on the dangers of extremism. As students ourselves, we have witnessed an increase in targeted violence on campus. As such, we want to promote awareness of extremism that exists on campus via a series of webinars to improve overall campus-wide resiliency. We believe that by partnering with students, faculty, and staff to provide education and a space for meaningful conversations on extremism, we can achieve peace through understanding. For more information about SDSU Cares, visit our website at sdsucares.com or on social media via LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Thank you everyone for attending this series, and I would like to turn it back over to Jamar to begin the discussion.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that, Caitlin. And like she said, this is definitely a great initiative that we're trying to achieve through this campaign. And we want to also thank our partners, McCain Institute and the Peer-to-Peer Protective Project. Sorry about that. Okay, so to get things started, I want to introduce our first speaker, and we will get going. All right, her name is Tammy Gillies, and she is the Regional Director of the Anti-Defamation League here in San Diego, as well as the Imperial Counties. She has oversight of the offices in Nevada and, can you hear me?
Hi, Tammy. Would you like to go second or first?
Hi, I'm sorry. My mistake. I should have spoken with you, Mohammed, but Chris and I thought that it would be best for Chris to lay a foundation first, and then I would jump on top of that. I'm very sorry, Jamal, for that.
Oh, no, not a problem. Not a problem.
So maybe start with Chris.
Not a problem. All right. So first, I'm going to present to you Mr. Christopher Tenorio. He's a federal prosecutor specializing in the investigation of civil rights and a trial attorney at the United States Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. He had the privilege of prosecuting one of the largest modern day slavery cases in our country back in 1998, which resulted in him receiving the John Marshall Award, all right, highest award that you can get for the type of work that he does. He studied philosophy at the University of California, Berkeley, and law at University of San Diego. Without further ado, here you are, Chris.
Thanks, Jamar. now that I have the mute on. I'm going to pull up to this my presentation. Let's see if we can do that. You'll be able to see this shortly. What I want to talk to you all about is addressing some of the concerns about violent extremism, targeted violence, and hate crimes. And I thought the best way to do that would be starting with some basics, including how we see hate crimes in the federal system, how we respond to those, and some of the efforts that we're doing with the San Diego Regional Hate Crimes Coalition. Is that available? Is the, good, okay, I'm seeing the confirmation. All right. First, starting with what a hate crime is, this is a very general definition that we see in federal court. One of the statutes, and we'll get to the fact that there's more than one statute. It's generally a criminal offense against a person or property motivated in whole or in part by an offender's bias, due to a victim's race, color, religion, disability, sexual orientation, national origin, gender, or gender identity. So the shortest way to describe it is what I highlighted in yellow. It's a criminal offense motivated by an offender's bias. And what separates this from a normal crime, and a lot of times we hear from people, why don't you just charge someone with another crime? Isn't a murder a murder? Isn't an assault an assault? Isn't that just a crime? Well, I think the easiest way to pinpoint why this is different and more and important and requires a lot more attention is the individual and the community impact of each hate crime. It affects not only the person directly to whom it's addressed, but perhaps their entire community and makes them feel less safe. Plus, there's a lot more motivation that goes behind it. It is generally motivated by a prejudicial motive. So you can have an assault, a battery, and then in addition to that, the prejudicial motive of the offender that targets more people. There's a lot of statistics that are available regarding the rise of hate crimes. This is actually a snapshot of 1992 to 2016, and wanted to show what the trends were. They were pretty steady, but you see race bias has always been at the top, and it was already starting to tick up in 2016. You see the orange line, which represents ethnicity bias incidents. That big spike there was in 2001, and that happened when shortly after 9/11, and those Muslims and those that were perceived to be Muslims were a greater target of hate crimes and hate incidents right after that. It came down a little bit thereafter and has evened out. I want to focus on a couple of things, and this is just giving straight statistics, not going to be commenting politics at all. But what I do want to point out is that right after the last presidential election, hate incidents spiked tremendously. This report is from the Southern Poverty Law Center that said 867 hate incidents occurred in the 10 days after the 2016 election. There are other reports, including from Cal State San Bernardino's Center for Study of Hate and Extremism, that in the month after the election, there were about 758 incidents. But the main point being here that it coincides with the national dialogue, the reporting of hate incidents and hate crimes. There have been more than just anecdotal evidence. There have been some some studies to see if there is a corresponding reaction, whether it's language or rhetoric that's out public that makes other people come out of the woodwork, so to speak, and feel more comfortable with expressing their hate. This, as I said, the first spike we saw was after 9/11. That was the highest spike of hate crimes in the 10 years surrounding that. Second one being in 2016, the election, and then after that, it was in the month following the incident in Charlottesville in August 2017, when shortly after the president said there are many fine people on both sides. So there have been studies, as I said, out of Cal State San Bernardino. There's another study out of North Texas University showing a correlation between what we're hearing and what the nation hears and how we react. So what we're suspecting is that's going to be happening nowadays too, during the COVID-19 pandemic and some of the language that you're hearing in certain corners. Now, these conclusions have to rely on good reporting. The FBI reports their crime statistics every November, which happens to go trace for the year before. So last November of 2019, we get the results from 2018. The problems, however, have been that the reports are only as good as, statistics are only as good as the reporting. The FBI is obligated under law to obtain these statistics. But there's also, with the Department of Justice, the Bureau of Justice Statistics, who also takes a national crime victimization survey. And what we've seen is that there is a big difference between what is being reported by the law enforcement agencies and what the Bureau of Justice Statistics is receiving from victims. First of all, let me start with this. This is from 2016, and it kind of breaks down what the percentage of the targets are in general. Excuse me, this is 2014. It's pretty consistent, however. Usually around half are racial hate crimes. I think in the most recent one, it was up to 57%, and over half of those are targeted towards African Americans. In 2018, it was 20%, pretty consistent with this, where it says religious, 18.6. So it holds pretty steady, and the great majority of those is the Jewish community being the target. And pretty closely behind it, and here it's equal, and sure enough, 19% in 2018 were sexual orientation. This again is from the FBI. But what we found is that there are gaps in the FBI data. We are dependent upon law enforcement agencies reporting what they receive. And here you can see some of the problems. Hawaii does not report any hate crimes. All those dots mark a gap in data. For example, Huntsville, Alabama Police Department has never reported a hate crime to the FBI. And so we've started asking, why is there a disparity? We found that there's a collection variability, how it's collected. There's definitional differences. In other words, how each locality defines what a hate crime is. There's also variances in the training of those that are receiving the reports. The reporting is voluntary, and sometimes there's a heightened standard. There's something we learned here, even in California, where one of the state jurisdictions reports, a lot of times something is reported as a battery, an assault, or a murder, and the statistic becomes simply that, and not until later, perhaps if there's more investigation, they realize there's a hate crime motivation to it, and then it's changed and identified as a hate crime. But it may not be reported to the FBI as a hate crime in the first instance. So here you can see that the difference between getting the information from law enforcement agencies and directly from victims shows a significant spike in what we consider to be hate crimes. And it could be that, well, we'll get to the reasons why in a second, but here you can see to the Department of Justice and FBI, over 5,800 were reported in 2015 and 7,300 in 2016. But according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, over 200,000 were reported in 2015. And it becomes different when perhaps they report to a agency, a non-law enforcement agency. Some of the reasons we've seen that, you know, there's either fear or lack of trust in law enforcement agencies to receive those reports. There might be a hesitation to reveal a vulnerability to a law enforcement agent. There's certainly cultural and linguistic barriers where there might be a fear or a disincentive or perceived disincentive to report to law enforcement, and a fear of reprisal. So what it does is it goes a long way of knowing, for us to know that there are a lot of incidents out there that do not get reported. Now, I participate in the San Diego Regional Hate Crimes Coalition, as does Ms. Gillies, who's going to speak after me. And we're comprised of a lot of non-governmental organizations, community groups, and law enforcement agencies. What we try to do is find out what the hot spots are out there in the community, how we can address them, and how we can reach out to educate people on what hate crimes are and encourage them to report as possible. Now, we keep in mind that not every report leads to a prosecution, but what it does do is establish some activities that are going on that might need more attention, and it can also provide evidence of bias or prejudice by a certain individual that might be evidence of their motivation in later activities. Some of the things that we've done have been to produce policy protocols for a lot of law enforcement agencies, training and outreach to law enforcement agencies on how to educate new recruits and existing law enforcement officers. And there have been a lot of public relation events out there that we've done. But most recently, this last year, we had a few forums throughout the county, as I said, mainly to target affected communities and tell them, these are what your rights are, why you should report anything you suspect of being a hate crime, to bring it to our attention so that we can address it either as a criminal investigation or further investigation to see how we can address it with community involvement and perhaps education. Some of the ways that we can address hate crimes from the federal perspective are through a variety of statutes, one being a few hate crime statutes, including one in 2009 that expanded the definition of what a hate crime is. There is a traditional statute from the Civil Rights Acts of the 60s that protect federally protected activities, and I'll get into what these mean here in a second. Also, housing discrimination, which we are seeing an uptick in currently, damage to religious property, and general threats that occur either by mail, telephone, or the internet. Now, hate crimes, as I mentioned, usually involve bodily injury, a weapon, or occur on federal property. If it's not covered by a federal statute, we work very closely, of course, with the DA's office, who handles the majority of these investigations because their jurisdiction is much broader. But we look generally to people that are targeted because of their race, color, religion, national origin, gender, sexual orientation, and disability. And it can vary depending on what the crime is and where it occurred, and whether it was a threat or there was actual bodily injury that occurred. For example, our older statute dating back to the 1960s requires interference with a federally protected activity. Now, what that means is a federally protected activity were things that were identified by Congress back in the 60s that certain persons, especially African Americans at that time, were prevented from enjoying, such as enrolling in public schools, going to public parks, and seeking out public accommodations such as hotels and restaurants, certain employment and travel. So That statute allows us to prosecute if we can prove that someone is targeting a group and trying to prevent them from enjoying one of those activities. It's an older statute that is limited to race, color, religion, national origin, and we go to some of the more recent statutes that would broaden that to include sexual orientation and gender. The fair housing law is much broader in the sense that it covers those that are even discriminated against because of familial status or handicap. And it can include an interference with any type of housing right, from applying for certain loans to renting or purchasing a house, or something as simple as receiving maintenance or help with rent. Now, what we're seeing nationally are a lot of reports that people who are able to pay their rent currently because of the pandemic affecting economic opportunities, there have been a lot of landlords out there who are saying, hey, in exchange for sexual favors, maybe I can overlook that you're not paying rent, or I won't kick you out in exchange for you doing something for me. We're really trying to put the word out that the Department of Justice is looking for these incidents and hoping that people report to us, because there is this extra vulnerability of the economic situation that's going on, and no one should be a victim of this at any time, but especially now we're seeing that it's a real possibility. Damage to religious property. Now, this would include any type of house of worship that might be targeted because of the religious character that's related to that property. But this is also just one statute. I prosecuted a arson at a synagogue about 15 years ago up in the Carmel Valley Ranch, and this statute didn't apply, but we prosecuted it because of the arson itself affecting interstate commerce and being able to target it that way. So these are just kind of the examples of some of the things that we start with of looking at it. Our biggest area of focus, or I should say that we get, are transmitted threats. And it brings me back to a point, we've mentioned the statistics. From 2018, there's actually been a dip in the overall number of hate crimes, but it's a 16-year high as far as the violence motivated by hate crime. So what does that mean? A lot of times in the past, or still, we see a lot of vandalism, whether they're swastikas or maybe a noose hanging somewhere. We're seeing, unfortunately, that it's now becoming interpersonal violence. And we're seeing a lot more of these threats, like direct threats, given to people either by mainly over the internet. It used to be by mail. People would mail threats, and that's almost antiquated at this point, or telephone. But we're seeing them through email and on social media, and even Zoom conferences like we're on now. We're seeing that if someone's threatening to injure somebody and knowing that it could be viewed as a threat, that can be a prosecutable offense. Or a cyber stalking offense could be like a course of conduct that causes substantial emotional distress. If this is happening, or if you know that it's happening, we recommend that you contact law enforcement right away, especially if you're in immediate danger. Always call 911, but these types of things can be investigated either by local authorities or the FBI. Now, one of the things that we're also seeing during the pandemic are a lot of protests by people who are unhappy with restrictive orders from the governor. What they're doing is exercising their First Amendment rights. However, we are also seeing the potential for it crossing the line of becoming threats. We can talk about why there's a correlation here in a minute, but we do have to point out, let me go back one, that we still retain our First Amendment rights, unless they're called what's under the law referred to as true threats. Now, a true threat is a serious expression of intent to commit an unlawful violence to a particular individual or group. That's when it crosses the line of not being protected by the First Amendment. Now, that includes Free speech protections cover stuff that is not predictive speech, that's not a conditional statement, such as, I will only do this if this occurs. Free speech also protects political hyperbole and something that is not an exhortation, which is a strongly urging someone to do something. So, for example, some things that we might hear. Someone yells, "Arab terrorists, it shouldn't be allowed." Is this hate crime or free speech? Now, it's hateful speech, but something like that would be protected by the First Amendment because it's a political statement, perhaps hyperbole, and well, it is hyperbole, and it's someone's opinion, but it's not threatening someone directly. It's not certainly not welcome, but we're looking at something that we would be able to prosecute. The next one, Jamal is a Muslim and someone should put a bullet in his head. Again, this is from studying past cases in which the courts have decided whether something is a true threat or not. Something like this would not be, unfortunately. In fact, this kind of language was an actual case and directed at President Obama. It says someone should is almost what someone's wishing would happen, but not threatened. Now, if someone were to say, call someone an effing Jew, I'm going to slit your throat, that would be a good example of a hate crime or a threat that would be a hate crime because of an intent to do that. Whereas the following one, if someone said, damn illegal Mexican, if murder weren't illegal, I would kill you. The conditional nature of that statement would probably would allow for it to be protected by First Amendment protections. Now, here's an example of something that is physical, but is actually speech, and a question of whether it would be a hate crime or free speech. It says "Die Jews" and has a swastika. Similar things have been a noose or a burning cross, or even more recently in our own community, someone wearing a KKK hood. Now, questions are, when does that cross the line? Certainly there are First Amendment protections. If we look at it and see when and where and the purpose of it, we might get closer to a hate crime. If this picture, for example, were in the house of people that were a home where Jewish people lived, and it was shown that it was trying to get them to move out, that's a federally protected activity, and the intent can be drawn from that. We've seen things such as cross burnings in parks in a well-known African American community. That could be possibly aimed towards a particular person or group and perhaps crossing the line. So my point being that it's not always easy upon first glance to see whether it's protected speech or a hate crime. And a lot of these things should be reported, not only so we can look further into it, perhaps define the intent of the person that did it, but also to let us know what's going out in the community, what we should be paying attention to, and how we can respond. And certainly, and I think I'll leave it at this, something we can discuss further, what's going on now and whether some of these free speech, these encroachments into free speech are crossing the line, or at least allowing the atmosphere to change to whether violent extremism might come as a result. So I will leave it at that. I'll turn it back to you, Mohammed, and be available for questions.
All right, Chris, thank you very much. That was very, very insightful and very, very thought-provoking. Again, those of you that are tuned in, please direct your questions for this first presenter to the chat block, and we'll make sure that we get to those after our next presenter. All right, so I think I'm gonna get it right this time. Without further ado, we're gonna present to you Tammy Gillies. All right, she is the regional director of the Anti-Defamation League for San Diego and the Imperial Counties. She also oversees the Nevada and Arizona offices. She's a native of New York, and she studied at the University of Vermont before beginning her career as the Director of Development in 2007. She then later went on in 2010 to become the Regional Director. All right, she takes the mission of the ADL very seriously, as well as her staff. And they have a dedication to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment for all. The San Diego office focuses on anti-bias education, civil rights, building bridges with different communities, and partnerships with the law enforcement community. All very, very important tenets of what we're trying to achieve as a collective. So without further ado, Tammy, it's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm really just honored to talk to all of you and that you've taken the time to listen to us. And thank you, Mohammed, for inviting me. Also, I just have to say that I've worked with Chris for a long time, and he's just such one of the good guys and really cares about helping all communities. And I just really appreciate him. So I have to start by saying that. Now you will see how not technically advanced I am, and I'm going to try to share my PowerPoint with you. And somewhere, here we go, slideshow. Nope, okay. Let's see, anybody have any advice for how to make this into a slideshow? Here we go, present, here we go, from the beginning. Okay. So here's what I'm going to talk with you all about today: the rise of anti-Semitism and hate. So you already heard about our mission of the ADL. We have been doing this since 1913 to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment to all. And I want to say that the "and" in that sentence is the most important word, because we have learned as a community that if any community is unsafe, we're all unsafe. And it's really important to us that we work on all sides of our mission. So I want to tell you a little bit about ADL, which will sort of lead into what we're seeing these days around hate. So this is just some background. We are a 501c3, so also probably going to try to stay away from politics, although sometimes I can't help myself. And we have 26 regional offices across the country. Our headquarters are in New York, and my colleagues are really struggling these days with COVID. So times are tough. Here's what we do. We fight hate, we build hope, and we safeguard liberty. That safeguard liberty is the civil rights piece of what we do. The hope is working with coalitions, because I don't think there's any agency or organization that can fight hate on its own. We have to all be in this together. That's why the San Diego Hate Crimes Coalition that Chris was talking about is so important, because we have to all be in this together fighting hate. So I want to talk a little bit about anti-Semitism, because this becomes a question that we hear a lot. Well, what is it? So this is what it is. It's prejudice towards Jews. And you're all smart. You all know that prejudice comes from prejudging somebody because of who you think they are, based on stereotypes. And that's what anti-Semitism is in an ADL definition. So what do we see in our office? We deal with white supremacist propaganda. I'll talk about that. What we see in the K through 12 schools, students being bullied, vandalism, a lot of anti-Israel, people that are discriminated at their jobs because of their religion. I think I'm going to quickly go through numbers, because Chris gave you a lot of good statistics, and I have to I just have to answer to you. You know, Chris was telling you that Huntsville, Alabama has never reported a hate crime. And I can tell you that just since COVID, they've had 2 synagogues that were tagged with "Kill All Jews" and swastikas. ADL offered a reward for that. So I will see if they come up next year, still reporting 0 hate crimes. Anyway, we can look at, we have a report coming out next week, ADL does, about anti-Semitic incidents in the US. And incidents have gone up, as Chris told you. There's been a spike. Physical assaults on Jews increased by 65% from 2018 to 2019. Incidents K through 12 schools were up by 19%. And 2/3 of American Jews feel less safe today than they did 10 years ago. And that's incredible to me. These are the numbers that Chris was showing you, just in a different way. This is just focused on anti-Semitism. The 2019 numbers that come out next week, you're going to see an increase in that. California, hate incidents. So these are not necessarily hate crimes, and I want to differentiate, but these are hate incidents that are reported to ADL and to law enforcement. And these are basically the same pie charts that Chris had shared with you. This is just speaking to California. Of religious-based hate crimes, the 2 most targeted groups, the Jewish community and the Muslim community. And people ask us at ADL all the time why we talk mostly about right-wing extremism. And this is the reason, that we have anti-Semitism on the left and we have anti-Semitism on the right, but the right tends to be violent. The left is more insidious, but the right tends to be violent, and that's why we focus on it and track it. So what do? We have a Center on Extremism. And that Center on Extremism, you can see these are some reports that we've put out over the course of the last couple of years. A lot of these reports are specifically for educating law enforcement, community members, leadership, what to look for, what's going on, what are the trends that we see. And you know, I'm talking to more about anti-Semitism, but really, when you look at this photo, some of it may be familiar to you. And what it is that we're all victims of the same horrible ideology, that white supremacist ideology. They are equal opportunity haters. So you see there the Chabad. I'm sure you're familiar with what happened at the Chabad last year in Poway. You've got the mosque at Christchurch in New Zealand. The church in the middle that was burnt down is one of the historically Black churches down in Louisiana. The Walmart in El Paso. I could go on. I think you've seen these. The Sikh temple. There's the JCC in Ohio. All places where hate crimes have taken place. I share this slide in my presentation because I don't know if you have heard of a young man by the name of Blaze Bernstein. Blaze Bernstein was a first-year college student who came from Orange County, and about a year ago was murdered by a classmate. He was home visiting from school, and he went out to meet an old high school classmate who took him into the woods and murdered him and buried him in a shallow grave because he was Jewish and he was a member of the LGBT community. And that person who was the murderer identified with the Atomwaffen division, which is what you're seeing here. This was a post of theirs. And it always reminds me that the haters that hate the Jews, they hate the Muslims, they hate the African American community, they hate immigrants, they're just equal opportunity haters. I had lunch right before we came into COVID quarantine with Blaze's grandparents. And I told them that I would keep this slide in my presentation because they are Holocaust survivors. And they want to make sure that people can understand that hate goes across the board and we all must stand for this, you know, stand in this space together. This is Robert Bowers, who shot up the Tree of Life Synagogue, killing 11 people. This is a word cloud off of his computer, and you all know what that means. So let's talk about anti-Semitism and the coronavirus. So these are just some memes that we pulled off of our Center on Extremism, pulled off the internet. And as you can see, you know, the coronavirus is really just Jews in disguise. The slide on the left is a Trojan horse. So it's the virus, but really inside it's the Jews because they want to control the world. So they're coming in behind the virus. And the slide on the right is obviously under a microscope. Wow, how interesting. The virus is really just Jews. For anybody familiar with Sheriff Clark, he of course tweets out that George Soros, who's a Jew, is involved with this. And the one on the right is from a French magazine. And of course, it's about the Jews and money, dollars and euros. So this is all just since COVID. You can read this. The slide on the left is, you know, Jewish man looking, somehow he's going to make money on this. And the same on the right. It goes back to, you know what, in the end, Uncle Sam is paying the Jews. Somehow we're making money off of this. And that's a stereotype that I'm sure everybody knows. But it's not just the Jews, because the Asian American Pacific Islander community has been targeted. We don't have the data yet, so I can only tell you anecdotally what we hear all the time now is the slurs. So it's the Jews and the Chinese. You know, let's make fun of it. Let's, you know, Winnie the Flu. I mean, these are just memes of let's give it nicknames. Let's make fun of the Chinese people. Okay, so these are just horrible, you know, exaggerations that lead people down the path of hate. You know, you should be afraid. Don't go to a Chinese restaurant. Well, now we can't, but you know, don't be amongst Chinese people because it's their fault. They're all bad. And of course, it always comes back to anti-immigration, right? We have to stop these people from coming into our country. It's the leftists, the liberals. These are all bad people. And it's not just the hate that we see around COVID, but it's the, how do we now, what can we do with this hate? How do we put this into action, right? How do we activate the COVID virus? So what they're saying is, oh, look, if you get infected, go to your local synagogue. Hug as many Jews as possible. You know, let's get all the Jews sick. Let's go into a kosher market and make sure that we get as many sick as we can. So hopefully we can kill them. You know, where did it come from? Oh, it came from China, but also maybe it came from the US or Israel, because Israel is always in there as a bad guy. And of course, it's also the liberals, right? And people want to take your guns. So there's all of these right-wing conspiracies that we're seeing around COVID. Weaponizing. So this is just, you know, more of the same. Going to, you know, the Jewish media. Let's see if, you know, what they'll do about it. Go cough on people, get rid of all the people that we don't like, go into the minority communities and bring your disease into those communities. So I have a few just recent slides to show you as I wrap up. And I'm sure most of you don't follow me on Twitter, but this was what happened at Vaughn's Santee last Saturday. A man shopping with a Klan hood, which really freaked a lot of people out. Terrible symbol of hate. Chris and I had conversations of, you know, is this a hate crime? Can this be charged federal civil rights? Chris can talk to that. He's much more knowledgeable, but here's a guy just shopping. And I have, you know, pictures of him in every aisle. People took photographs and, you know, pictures of him in his hood on the checkout line. And, you know, you have to wonder what leads somebody to make that choice to wear a Klan hood. This was last Friday. I hope that these are not anybody that you all know, because I don't want to be insulting, but this was the Reopen California protests that were downtown last Friday. And on the mask, you know, we see the Nazi symbols, the swastika. ADL takes particular offense with anybody comparing, here's Governor Newsom, right, with a Hitler mustache, and here's Governor Newsom and Hitler. We take offense at people making Holocaust references because you may feel that being stuck in your house during COVID watching Netflix is like you're being controlled by the Nazis, but I'm telling you that it's not, and nothing compares to what happened in Nazi Germany. So these kind of things really are just false and lead people down the wrong path. So quickly, what do we do about all of this hate? At ADL, we do a lot of education. We're in a lot of schools in San Diego, and once we get back out, we hope to also be at San Diego State doing some work with Mohammed in anti-bias training. This is actually the pyramid of hate that we use when we talk about hate and violence. And I'm going to leave this up for just a minute because it's so much of what Chris talked about. And you know, we say that the gas chambers at Auschwitz were not started with bricks, but were started with words. And if you look at the bottom, the base of this pyramid, it's just about stereotyping and, you know, fearing people that are different than you. And if you then take that to the next level, you have bullying and name calling. And if that goes unchecked, that goes to the next level. Discrimination, housing discrimination. And if that goes unchecked, you know, where do we go? Up to the very worst, which is genocide. And people ask us at ADL, why do we call out every little act of hate? Why do we call out the guy at Vaughn's with the Klan hood? It's because we do not want to work our way up this pyramid. We need to shine a light on hate before we get to the top of that pyramid. We talk, we lobby a lot. We work, as I mentioned, with the community. After the Poway shooting last year, we had a vigil with 4,000 community members that came out from every part of our community to stand with us, and it was amazing. And that's we're all in this together. So we have a lot of work that we're proud of. The most important piece on this that I'll share with you is that we have allies, but we have to be an ally. We have to stand up for each other. If you see something when you're at school, if you hear something, you have to stand up. You can't be silent. We all have to be advocates against hate. And of course, report incidences. You can report to ADL. There's a great reporting system at San Diego State. So it doesn't have to reach a level of a crime. You can report an incident because the school needs to know what's going on and what you're all facing on campus. So I think that's it. I'm gonna leave it there, and I thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Tammy. That was definitely a lot to take in and a lot of very important information and some alarming statistics. I do have some questions from the group. As I said earlier, those of you, please keep them coming. And it looks like you're up first, Tammy, if you're ready for it. So I have someone that asks, given the challenges of COVID-19, what can we do to better combat hate against our Asian American community?
You know, I think that you have to reach out. It's about being an ally, right? Since we're all sort of staying away from each other, you can pick up the phone, you can call friends in that community. Hey, I'm here for you. If you hear somebody, you know, we all are on these Zoom happy hours and things like that now. If you hear a joke, if you hear something that is offensive, you have to stand up and say, hey, oh, wait a minute, you know, I don't like that. It makes me uncomfortable. And sometimes it's hard to do that with our friends, but we have to do it. We just have to be aware, and hopefully when everybody gets back onto campus, you take these same thoughts with you of building allyship and working together.
Oh, thank you very much for that response. All right, I have another one here, and this is actually for both of you. What do you think higher education institutions can do to combat hate and extremism on campuses, not only here in San Diego, but across the country?
You know, I can address something real quickly. One of the things that we've seen both traditionally and here are there's a lot of communities on campus that don't feel welcome, and that's directly interfering with their federally protected right to receive an education. There, in past years, recent years, on a lot of the college campuses, not just San Diego State, but in the city, there have been, you know, random swastika here, a noose there, and it's kind of handled within the community. Well, this is not affecting just the community on campus, but the community at large, and everyone's aware of it. I think that the campuses are a great laboratory for thought and sharing, and that's one of the pluses where you can all talk about it and come up with creative ideas on how to address hate incidents that don't lead to someone like me coming in with a federal prosecution, but can perhaps start dialogue to say, all right, this is why it's offensive to our community. This is why words matter. And yeah, we're an insulated community here within our university, but it reaches out to a lot more than just us students here. So I think that's where you could start. My office and the FBI is the last resort, but with the coalition, we do things that we can reach out and help facilitate dialogue.
Well, we look forward to being able to work with the university. I think that different groups, as Chris was saying, you know, different groups have to come together. And I think it's a falsehood to think that we all have to agree on everything in order to do something together. And, you know, there's a local imam in town that I work with frequently. And when I first took this job, we sat down together and we said, you know what, we are not going to agree on everything. There are just things, you know, like Israel, we're not going to agree. Let's just put it out there on the table. But you know what? We're both leaders in our community, and we care about creating a safe and good community here in San Diego. What can we work on together? It's about the students. It's about what do we want to build here? So I think that there's this false sense of, well, if we're not all in together, you're not part of us. And I think that I'd love to see student organizations just find pieces of connection together and get to know each other as people, and continue the work. And I think that's maybe what you're all doing here. So I applaud that.
Thank you for that. This next question is actually for you, Chris, and it says, what do you think, or what is your prediction about the judicial process and how it might play out for the two men that are alleged to have murdered a Georgia man, Ahmaud Arbery, earlier during this COVID-19 pandemic as he was jogging in broad daylight in Georgia.
You know, there's a lot, I don't have a lot of the information yet, but I can talk about maybe how the process works out. The federal government comes in when, and I think we see Tammy, I don't know if you see me. The state authorities will have to address it. And this is where we start getting to whether there is a uniform application of the law in certain areas. The Civil Rights Division out of the Department of Justice in DC, where I used to work, kind of supplements approaches to the law where a local government is either unwilling or unable to pursue a matter sufficiently. We're pretty fortunate here in San Diego County that the district attorney's office here is very vigilant and very active on pursuing hate crime prosecutions. Depending on where that, the locality where that offense committed, how committed their local prosecutors are will affect what happens. But there is always a backstop with the Civil Rights Division that can go in and assist. And certainly where something that seems, without commenting too much on what the evidence is, it certainly seems like something is racially motivated and leading to violence. That could be a federal offense that could be addressed if the local prosecution group is not able to.
Thank you very much for that. And I actually have another question for you. Given the rise of hate and extremism in San Diego County and the rest of the country, what advice would you give to communities so that they can better protect themselves? This is actually for both of you.
You know, I think one of the things that we're talking about now is reporting more often, discussing it. There's a lot of not only fear, but shame when people are victims of this. Like say they're walking down the street and someone drives by and yells out an N-word at you, or go back to your country, something like that. People are ashamed of that and don't like to express that, you know, I'm victimized because of who I am, how I'm perceived. We need to kind of create an atmosphere where that's okay to talk about. Even Martin Luther King Jr. said there's a lot of value in being able to shame someone for having bad attitudes, and we've lost that a bit. You know, people are becoming emboldened and saying a lot of things out loud that weren't being said in polite company just a couple of years back. So I think certainly if we encourage everyone to talk about what's happening to them, they'll start appreciating what's going on, especially those that aren't from communities that are maybe targeted as much as saying, oh, really? That you actually get people that walk on the other side of the street as you, or perhaps look at you wrong because of the way you look. And you say, you have to tell them, yes, this happens. And with that recognition, I think it's going to be easier for people to accept that there are hate crimes and hate incidents happen. And I think the shame that was leaped on this guy at the Vons wearing the hood is a perfect example of that. And hopefully people will now be thinking twice before doing anything like that.
Thank you very much for that response. Tammy, do you have one?
You know, I'll just briefly echo what Chris is saying, because we used to say, and I think one day it'll be true again, is that data drives policy. And the more we know, and it includes your campus, the more that the administration knows about the incidents or what's happening on campus, the better they can address those things. So I think coming forward and being an ally to those coming forward is really important. And maybe bringing Chris and his team or the district attorney's office in when we get back into the real world, or even on one of these, to teach more about what is a hate crime, what is a hate incident, And what is the reporting system at state for people to understand, or even when you're off campus? So I think the reporting is really, really key.
Thank you very much for that. We've got time for a few more. And this one is actually for you, Tammy. What is and can the ADL do in our community to deter our hate crimes?
You know, I think there are a lot of things. Mostly it's around education. So we have seen last school year, every single campus, every single college and university campus in San Diego was stickered with white supremacist stickers. Every single one. I don't know, Chris, you can correct me, but I don't think there was one campus that was left out. And these are ways of recruiting, right? So these people are trying to radicalize students, recruit them. This is the alt-right. And we need to be aware. We need to educate people about what this is, because it looks like you're going into a meeting of one thing and they draw you in, but it's really something else. So I think educating the community is really important. ADL is the largest non-governmental trainer of law enforcement in the country. And people think that's a little odd that we're a civil rights organization that works closely with law enforcement. And I can talk about that a whole nother day, but the importance of that is that we train law enforcement on what is a hate crime. How do you know what it is, and how can you document it so that when you go to trial, you can prove that that's a hate crime? This is really important because we build trust with the law enforcement community and ADL. And that trust then extends into training on implicit bias, which builds bridges between communities and law enforcement. And I think that's another piece of it, right? If we trust more and we work together more, we can reduce some of this violence that we see. So.
Thank you for that response. You're pretty popular this evening. From the chat, could or would you be willing to talk about the No Place for Hate initiative and how that could work? Either of you.
So No Place for Hate is ADL's anti-bias programming. We do it all across the country. We would love to bring some form of it to SDSU. It is really led by the student community. We do it in, K through 12 and then into universities, because, we can't legislate our way out of hate. We can't, the only way out of hate is through education. I believe it. I mean, we have all the laws and we have these things, but if we can talk to people and get them to understand about their own biases and how they show themselves in the world, I think we can really make a difference. And that's what No Place for Hate program is about. So would love to bring that more to campus.
Could I add another statistic that goes to that point? We talked about how a lot of language from our leaders, there's a direct correlation to an uptick in violence. Here's a perfect example of the opposite having an effect also. 6 days after the terror attacks on 9/11, President George W. Bush came out and said, the face of terror is not the true faith of Islam. As I mentioned earlier, that was our worst month in a decade, the hate crimes that occurred after 9/11. As soon as he said that, the very next day, 2/3 of the hate crimes dropped, and it continued to drop for the following year. So it shows that words matter not only in increasing these things, but have the opposite effect too. If we speak out in our community and in your respective communities, it has an effect. So please take that to heart also.
Thank you very much for that. So I have one more question for you, Chris, before we wrap up. And this one, based on a lot of the statistics that you presented to us earlier, who would you say is most at risk in our local communities?
It's a great question because we can see that it's both situational and historical. We've been reaching out a lot to the Asian and Pacific Islander community recently because there's been an increase in reports that they're being targeted. And just like there was for the Arab community or anyone that looked Arab right after 9/11. And we're going to see spikes in that. But we, as I mentioned earlier, well over half of hate crimes are directed against people because of perceived race, and 50% of that 50% are almost always African Americans. And then, as we mentioned, another 20% is religious based, and it's still consistently against the Jewish community. We've seen increases, as I said, against perceived Muslims that get spikes, and it's still steady. But we have these traditional groups that are always targeted. But right now, we're seeing Asian Americans being targeted, just like Latinos. We saw a big uptick after the last presidential election because immigration was brought to the forefront. So keep in mind that what's in the news is going to affect who's going to be victimized, but we still always have certain communities that are receiving a lot of the attention.
Thank you for that, Chris. Definitely wonderful responses. And that appears to be about all the time that we have today. I want to thank everyone that tuned in and joined us. I want to just thank all of you for being here. Of course, thank you to both of these wonderful facilitators to share the knowledge and experiences that you bring, a very eclectic bunch of people, and we're very, very grateful for that. Let's not let this end here. Let's continue to learn. Let's continue to be tolerant of one another, especially in these difficult times. SDSU Cares, we'd like to encourage you to follow us through our social medias on Twitter, SDSU Cares, as well as on Facebook. And these videos will be posted so this information can continue to spread in a positive way so that we can affect change and hopefully achieve peace through understanding. That's our motto. So thank everyone for tuning in, and let's make it a great week.
Thank you.
Thank you.